Okay. So, hello everybody. Welcome to tonight's Socialist Action Canada webinar. It is titled Ice Out. Minneapolis shows the way forward. Imperial lands off immigrant workers, Venezuela, Cuba, Mexico, Iran, Palestine, and Greenland. Tonight's event features speakers Kshama Sawant, former city councilor in Seattle, current socialist candidate for U.S. Congress, and Jeff Mackler, National Secretary, Socialist Action USA, and a leading member of the United National Anti-War Coalition. My name is Elizabeth Byce. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, and past Secretary of the Toronto New York Region Labour Council. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people in the place called Toronto. Today, I'm speaking to you from Jamaica, where the indigenous Taino and Arawak-speaking people began arriving here 4,000 years ago. They were wiped out by European colonial powers. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. So following the presentation by our guest speakers for about 20 minutes each, there will be time for a Q&A from the audience to our speakers. Now I'm honored to introduce our first speaker. Kshama Sawant is a revolutionary socialist, a founding member of Workers' Strike Back, and a former Seattle City Council member 3 times elected. She led the movement to win the highest minimum wage in America, as well as the Amazon tax on wealthy corporations to fund affordable housing. Born in India, Kshama immigrated to America in 1996. Taught economics, and became a U.S. citizen. She is now running for the U.S. Congress in the state of Washington as a member of her Revolutionary Workers' Party. Welcome to our show, Kshama.
Thank you for including me on your program. Trump's ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is terrorizing American cities. Peaceful activists like Renee Good and Alex Petty have been murdered by ICE in broad daylight. There was a call to action of a day of no work, no school, no shopping for January 23rd. This call to action led to a historic protest of over 100,000 people in Minneapolis, joined by hundreds of thousands nationally. The series of protests that have rocked cities nationally have been crucial and have put pressure on the Trump administration, and we need to build on the momentum of those protests going forward. At the same time, we need to be clear with working people that the January 23rd day of action was not a general strike as it has been widely described. Many small businesses across the Twin Cities metro and Minnesota state did close their doors for part or all of January 23rd, but overwhelmingly the large corporations that constitute most of the city's economy, including companies like Target and IBM, all remained open. And it's not that the conditions for organizing a mass strike weren't present. They were, but the missing element was leadership. Unfortunately, rather than taking the lead in shutting down the city's economy, the leadership of the labor movement remained mostly absent, refused to mobilize rank and file members to a strike, and even actively discouraged members from striking. And absolutely, working people urgently need to organize strike actions leading up to a general strike to shut down ICE. However, to succeed in that, the American working class will need to address 3 necessary conditions. One is that we need to rebuild the mass rank and file militancy in the unions and the wider working class in order to overcome the obstacles presented by most of the current labor leadership. Second is that our movements must overcome all types of gatekeeperism. Third is that our movements need to fight the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. These 3 conditions are all interconnected. We need a reckoning in the American labor movement against the current labor leadership. These labor leaders, unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of them don't want strikes. They don't want mass action. They're afraid to even mobilize workers because fundamentally they see themselves as mediators between themselves and the bosses. This is all connected to the equally urgent need to build a mass struggle for a new working class party. The lack of such a party leaves the Democrats, including the so-called progressive Democrats, as a huge obstacle to our class and our movements. We have to overcome the misleadership of the labor leaders and so-called progressive Democrats in order to be able to win anything like shutting down ICE and the detention centers and stopping the deportations. This was one of the lessons of my decade as a revolutionary socialist on the Seattle City Council. We won unheard of in our current era, unheard of historic victories like the highest minimum wage in the nation, the Amazon tax, as Elizabeth mentioned, for affordable housing, unprecedented renters' rights, free abortion, and a lot more. But to win each of these things, we had to build powerful movements to send the message to these misleaders that it would be very bad for their political careers to stand in our way. We didn't win one damn thing by trying to sweet talk them. The only language that worked was the language of working class power put into action. Strikes are the most powerful action, short of revolution itself, that we have as workers against the capitalists. Throughout the history of capitalism, it was by organizing mass strikes that workers won any measure of improvement in their wages, working conditions, and living standards. Strikes are based on the fundamental reality of global capitalism that the economic engine of profits of the billionaires and multimillionaires is derived directly from the labor of billions of workers. Wages represent a fraction of the production and wealth that workers generate from their labor. The rest is taken from them by the capitalists. However, because all wealth is derived from our labor, workers have the ability to shut down profits for the bosses by shutting down production. A general strike is when workers carry out a work stoppage and shut down the profits across workplaces, sectors, and industries in an entire city, region, or nation. A general strike can be a potent tool in the hands of the working class. By shutting down the business of an entire city, region, or nation, a general strike has the potential power to bring the capitalist machine to its knees. And this is unfortunately not what happened in Minneapolis last month, though it did happen in Minneapolis before, as many of us know, in 1934 under the leadership of revolutionary socialists. Organizing a general strike and making it successful by winning the strike's demands is far from straightforward. Successful strike actions, especially general strikes, need leaders who are crystal clear about the class antagonisms between bosses and workers under capitalism, and that the needs of the workers and the greed of the bosses are irreconcilable. They need to understand that to win anything, workers must wrest the victories from the bosses through strong organization and militant action. This is class struggle unionism. Leaders who agree with class struggle unionism will arm the rank and file with a formidable fighting strategy capable of overcoming the arsenal of strike-breaking weapons of the bosses. For example, bosses routinely employ replacement workers, also called scab workers, in a divide and conquer tactic to undermine a strike. Class struggle unionist leaders develop responses to win over the scab workers by convincing them that the divide and conquer trap of the bosses is a race to the bottom for all workers, including themselves, and that all workers must stand in solidarity with the strike. Class struggle unionists also fight to prevent scab workers from being able to break the strike by organizing community-wide working class solidarity campaigns. They urge members and of other unions to stand with the strike and also carry out solidarity strikes. Crucially, class struggle unionist leaders also recognize that the political parties of capitalism represent the capitalist state and exist to defend the interests of the capitalist class. In the United States, that means understanding that both the Democratic and Republican parties are hostile to the interests of workers. It means having a strategy to defeat the repression and even violence that the Democrats and Republicans will use and have historically used again and again in order to break strikes. Class struggle unionism means recognizing that the actual purpose of progressives in the Democratic Party is to try to whitewash the party's pro-capitalist agenda. New York City hospital bosses have spent upwards of $100 million in hiring out-of-state scab nurses in an attempt to undercut the currently ongoing historic strike of nurses. New York's Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul signed and repeatedly renewed an executive order making it easier for the bosses to hire the scabs. But New York City's Democratic Mayor Zoran Mamdani, who is a prominent leader of the Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA, who visited the picket line of the nurses, has also at the same time shamefully endorsed anti-worker corporate Democrat Hochul in her re-election bid. As I said, the vast majority of current American labor leaders subscribe to the ideas of business unionism. Business unionist leaders avoid any militant confrontation with the bosses, focus on the so called bargaining table, and discourage strike actions or any kind of fighting approach. Business unionists do sometimes use strike threats when they feel under pressure to do so, under pressure from the rank and file, but as abstract leverage to be used at the bargaining table rather than actually building worker power. In reality, this signals to the bosses that any talk of a strike is generally an empty threat. One of the most scandalous outcomes of the hollowing of the militancy from the American labor movement and the loss of class struggle unionism is how no strike clauses have become almost ubiquitous in American labor union contracts. Throughout history, most of the important strikes were in defiance of the law. That's because it is the capitalists who write the laws and they want to tie our hands in every possible way. This is also why bosses insist on no strike clauses and why workers and unions need to fight ferociously against them. In Minneapolis, the leaders of multiple unions shamefully referred to the no strike clause in their contracts and warned their rank and file members not to take any strike action on January 23rd. It is a massive historical irony that as ICE and Trump are murdering workers and are in violation of even the laws of their own capitalist state, these labor leaders are fretting over no strike clauses. Business unionism is the single biggest obstacle today to rebuilding the fighting labor movement that could turn the tide against the billionaires. In order to win victories like shutting down ICE, workers need to understand all this, and they need to understand on the whole that gatekeepers are not on our side. Who are these gatekeepers and what is their role? Gatekeepers are self appointed or elected leaders who, on the surface, appear like they should be on our side. Gatekeepers are leaders who say they support progressive things, but whose role in reality is to put the brakes on any fight back by working people. They include the progressive Democratic politicians, they include most NGO leaders. Inside the labor movement, the gatekeepers are the business unionist leaders, which is, as I said, overwhelmingly most of the current American labor leaders. Being clear about the role of gatekeepers is a make or break for movements. When movement leaders are not clear about this, movements reach a dead end. This is why the Black Lives Matter movement ended up winning so little, despite being the largest street protest movement in American history. Labor and NGO gatekeepers are both the most visible and yet the most invisible enemies of the working class. We won our victories in Seattle because we refused to back down to the gatekeepers. We built an overwhelming mobilization of our movement that threatened the political careers of not only the Democratic Party politicians if they voted against us, but also of many of the prominent labor and NGO leaders. There are hundreds of examples I could give, but for time, I'll just talk about our fight for the $15 minimum wage, which is now $21.30 an hour in Seattle, and as I said, the highest in the nation. In order to win, we had to overcome the obstacles of all these gatekeepers again and again. When we launched our campaign, $15 an hour was one of our key demands, alongside rent control and taxing the rich to fund vital public services. These were our main demands when we ran for city council in 2013. As we campaigned for 15, during the election year, the issue ended up catching fire and became a mass discussion among workers in our city, mainly thanks to our campaign. But before that, at the very outset, we were told by the labor leaders, don't campaign for 15. They told us it wasn't winnable and they asked us to back off. On top of that, they supported our opponent, the most powerful Democrat at the time in Seattle, Richard Conlin, who openly opposed $15 an hour. Not a single Democrat on the city council, including the progressives, supported 15 for that entire campaign year, election year. It was only well after we won our election that any of them came out for 15. But at a certain point, when 15 was wildly popular because of our campaign, the labor leaders decided they wanted to work with us. So we did. We developed a united front with them. But in doing so, we made it clear that we had differences over strategy with them and we weren't about to hide those differences, and we didn't. The first big clash came when early in the next year, in 2014, after I took office, one of the most prominent labor leaders informed a group of us that there was no chance we could win $15 an hour, that we would have to settle for 11 or we would win nothing at all. And this was at a time when the opinion polls were at their very highest in support for 15. It was absolutely egregious. I stood up and informed this labor leader and the rest of the room that if they attempted to go forward with this betrayal of the working class, I would hold a press conference the following morning and I would name names. This is what forced them to back off. The next big conflict came when the labor leaders told us we had to abandon our ballot initiative for 15, which our movement had launched as a credible threat that if the Democrats didn't pass a strong $15 bill in the city council, then we would take the issue to the voters directly that November. The labor leaders did not want to upset their relations with the Democrats because, of course, they are all part of one big club. And so they hated this ballot initiative tactic. We explained to them repeatedly that we could not accept that ending the ballot initiative effort would throw away all our leverage. We said, can't we just agree to disagree on this point and continue working together where we do agree? But they refused to accept that because they are doing the bidding of the Democratic Party and ultimately of big business. And we didn't back down either. Ultimately, they threw us out of their coalition. We didn't make that split public, though, because we didn't want the corporate media to make hay of it. And we encouraged them to also do the same, but we went forward with our ballot initiative. A few weeks later, under pressure directly from that ballot initiative, we won. And then in the months and years afterwards, $15 an hour spread from Seattle to around the country, benefiting tens of millions of workers. So the gatekeepers failed and our movement won, including automatic inflation adjustment on the basis of our class struggle strategy. We correctly applied United Front tactics. We never misunderstood the United Front to mean that we had to keep the labor leaders, Democrats, or any of the gatekeepers happy. That's what the DSA leaders based themselves on. And they call it the United Front, but it's absolutely wrong. And in fact, their own terminology is accurate for it. They call it light touch solidarity. At the heart of the United Front is the need to put the interests of the working class first, not relations with the gatekeepers. A hallmark of business unionism and gatekeeperism in general are its very tight links with the parties of capitalism. In the United States, it means very close ties between the Democratic Party and the business unionist leaders and the NGO leaders. Republican President George W. Bush's Department of Homeland Security Act of 2002, which created ICE, was passed with the votes of 88 House Democrats and 41 Senate Democrats. Among those voting to create and continually fund ICE is Democratic Congressman Adam Smith of Washington's 9th Congressional District, the 29-year warmongering genocidal Democrat that we are running to defeat this year. Adam Smith is responsible for the brutal murder of working class people and immigrants within the United States and millions internationally. He is one of the 5 remaining House Democrats who voted for the war on Iraq. He has voted for multiple wars. He has voted for tens of billions of dollars for the genocide in Gaza. He voted to create ICE and has voted to fund ICE year after year. But Smith is not an outlier in the Democratic Party. Throughout the party's history, elected Democrats have zigzagged between political positions whenever it is convenient for them to protect their careers, to keep working people trapped between the two parties that are both pro-capitalist, and to direct workers away from fighting for what we need and deserve. Working people need to completely reject the Democratic Party in order to be able to bring down Trump and ICE. We need independent movements, and we need to fight for a new party of working people. As the idea of strikes and a general strike has become increasingly popular among rank and file workers nationally, some labor leaders are now peppering their speeches with the strike word, but as an empty gesture with no announcements of any actual strike organizing. My organization, Workers Strike Back, is fighting for a way forward. This weekend, along with our congressional campaign, we are co-hosting a mass meeting to fight for a general strike, where we will discuss the concrete strategy of how union members and non-unionized workers can begin to push for strike actions. A crucial part of that strategy is to build a fight within the unions. We will have petitions and resolutions workers can use in their union to bring maximum pressure to bear against resistant union leaders. We have made extensive use of such petitions and resolutions in much of our work and have found that they can be very effective if you have an organized core of class-conscious workers fighting for them. The mass protests in Minneapolis and around the country have been historic. General strike is now a popular call. We need to tap into that popular call. And around the country, workers, both union and non-union, are asking, why can't we go on strike? The openness among millions of workers for a real general strike is now greater than it has been in decades. The political situation today is intense and volatile, but the potential for winning real gains is real because the political establishment is so discredited. We can win if we get organized around a class struggle strategy. Working people globally increasingly understand just how rotten the capitalist system is and are looking for a way to fight back. The capitalist state is trying to suppress this anger through violence, but this has convinced working class people of the need to escalate the struggle in order to win. My congressional campaign is calling for an end to ICE and the closure of the detention centers, free healthcare for all, and national rent control to combat the cost of living crisis, and to a permanent end to all US military aid to the Israeli state, an end to the brutal occupation, and ultimately an end to this capitalist system. Many working people agree with us. We are building a movement nationally around these demands. People who have donated to our campaign span the entire nation, all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. Working people and young people are rejecting this system of capitalism, which has driven us from one crisis to the next and towards total disaster for human civilization and the planet. This is why we are building Workers Strike Back and Revolutionary Workers, the organizations that I helped found to expand nationally the fighting methods of our Socialist Seattle City Council office. Our members are organizing nationally on this basis to turn the tables against Trump and both parties of the billionaires. We have enormous potential power to do so if we base ourselves on militant working class power, and we are really looking forward to working alongside Socialist Action and other organizations who agree that we need to bring back the militancy of the proud American labor and Marxist movement. Solidarity.
Thank you very, very much. Okay, our next speaker is Jeff Mackler. Jeff is an outstanding revolutionary political activist based in Oakland, California. He is the National Secretary of Socialist Action, the sister party of SA Canada. He was the nominee of Socialist Action for U.S. Senate from California in 2006 and for President of the United States in 2016 and 2020. Jeff is also a director of the Mobilization to Free Mumia Abu Jamal and a leading member of the United National Anti-War Coalition, better known as UNAC. Jeff played a leading role in freeing anti-war activist Julian Assange, who spent 5 years in a London jail on false U.S. charges of espionage. Welcome to the webcast, Comrade Jeff.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you, Kshama, for your magnificent speech. I should tell your audience that Kshama and I will be doing a U.S. tour between March 20th and 25th, covering 5 U.S. cities in the San Francisco Bay Area, arguing for the independent mass mobilization of the working class to win critical victories, as opposed to any type of support for capitalist candidates, the Democrats and Republicans. So I think it's going to be an exciting tour to hear 2 revolutionaries speaking all over the Bay Area, from San Jose to Santa Rosa, San Ramon, Berkeley, and everywhere else. Let me tell you about Donald Trump. I think the most accurate description, if you'll forgive the words, was by his appointed Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. How many of you knew when what Rex Tillerson said to a meeting of the National Security Council after Trump had left the room and proposed a 200% increase in the number of nuclear weapons that the United States had, and then he left the room? You know what Tillerson's remark was? Well, he called, I don't know if I can say it on this show, he called Trump an effing moron, which is exactly what he is. The difference between Trump and the Democrats is that Trump says out loud what the Democrats have done for decades. There's no fundamental difference. What drives Trump forward today is the fact that American capitalism is in crisis, and they have no idea what to do about it. In 2008, a group of the richest bankers in the United States, if not the world, assembled in Washington, D.C. They had all the statistics, and they said that unless the United States government comes up with this bailout proposal, which they wrote on 2 pages, the entire US economy is coming to a grinding halt. The ruling class, and it was literally the ruling class in that room in a Washington, D.C. hotel, sitting around a huge mahogany table. It was the Rockefellers and the Mellons, the biggest banks, the multi-billionaires and trillionaire corporations. They wrote down what they thought on 2 pages, and they headed to Washington, D.C., stopping by George Bush's office. And when they showed George Bush the document and stated, quote, if the Congress doesn't pass this bill, which was roughly a $1 trillion instant bailout of the major banks and corporations in the country, the entire economy is coming to a grinding halt. Guess what George Bush, the president of the United States, had to say with these billionaires? Why didn't anyone tell me? And that is, here is the president of the United States facing the largest economic crisis in the country's recent history, with the banks, all of the banks, because of the subprime mortgage crisis, in crisis, threatening to basically say, we don't have the money to pay the bills. And all George could say was, I had no idea. Of course, they went to the Congress, and the Congress, in a matter of 2 days, bailed out the United States government because they didn't have the money, with credit, with loans that they simply reinvested in the stock market, which has been continuing as a source of wealth to the rich. Today or yesterday, the stock market, the Dow Jones reached 50,000, the highest in history. It has nothing to do with a measure of the success of the capitalist economy, but rather the massive speculation that the ruling class engages in order to boost the profit rates, which is near zero in the private sector. Capitalism is not profitable. That's the reason why the moron, Bush, Trump, runs around the country with some assistants and a piece of paper saying to the heads of state everywhere, if you don't pass this bill, if you don't lower the tariffs, if you don't do what I say, the United States is going to impose massive punishment on you. He says the same thing to every nation on earth, whether it be the former, quote, worker states of China and Russia. China now has the largest number of billionaires in the world, or whether or not he says it to the heads of the NATO countries, France or England. He has the same message. You're going to do what I say in order to make US corporations rich, or we're going to punish you, and we have the wealth to do it. Today, that punishment extends to the president's fantastic remarks. He wants to take over Canada. He wants to impose massive tariffs on Canadian corporations. He wants to take over Greenland, basically. And the reason for this is because US corporations can't compete on world markets. They can't dig up out of their own soil rare earth metals that are necessary for the technological advancement of the capitalist system. So they want to take over Greenland. That's the reason why the United States is basically eliminating all the greenhouse gas production, why it's eliminating all the restrictions on the production of greenhouse gases, why President Trump says to Elon Musk the head of the largest electric car manufacturers, we're taking away your $1 trillion subsidy because we don't want to produce non-polluting electric vehicles. We want to go with fossil fuels. That's the reason why the United States is basically funding the Ukraine war, because they wanted to substitute the trillions of dollars in natural gas that Russia was producing and giving and selling at the cheapest prices to Germany and Europe, and force the Europeans to basically buy American fossil fuels. It was another, and that's the reason why they did the same thing in Venezuela. In an unprecedented way, publicly, I say, they invaded Venezuela, captured the president and his wife, and dragged them off to New York City dungeon because they wanted absolute control of the fossil fuel industry in Venezuela, which has the largest reserves in the world. They claimed that he was a drug dealer, but in truth, the largest drug dealers in the world are none other than U.S. corporations and U.S. banks who fund the drug pushing in the United States. That was what Ollie North's Contragate was about. The United States demonstrated point blank that it was number one in the world in introducing CIA crack cocaine into the United States, which they sold illegally to the Nicaraguan Contras in order to fund an illegal war. It was illegal because in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the United States was discredited around the world. The Vietnamese defeated the United States troops because of the massive opposition of the American people and the Vietnamese people. The United States murdered 4 million Vietnamese and countless more Cambodians and people elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So, and they engaged in the drug trade throughout the war, shipping and providing American troops with crack cocaine in order to soothe their consciences and their personalities so they could engage in genocide. 4 million people died in Vietnam. 4 million Vietnamese, 90% of them innocent civilians, men, women, and children. That's the same thing that happened everywhere in the world. The United States has 1,100 military bases in 110 countries, and they are engaged, according to US statistics that were published in the New York Times and The Nation. They are engaged in 134 military operations around the world. And they use the military and the army and the national security apparatus. There are 15 agencies in the United States that are engaged in national security. Guess how many people have clearance to work in that business? Take a wild guess. 5 million people. And when one of them, whether that one be, what's his name, Edward Snowden or Julian Assange, reveals through their official files of the government that the United States secretly arms and weaponizes in violation of US law countries around the world, they are subject to the wrath of hell. Julian Assange was threatened with a lifetime imprisonment for telling the truth about US weapons. He simply had access to a couple of people who had national security clearance and a conscience out of the 5 million who gave him the files. And the same thing with Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder. Any person who stands up, that gives you an idea of what they have in store for us. And monstrosity is the word. And it's not, as I said, just Trump. Chris Hedges, a former Pulitzer Prize writer for the New York Times, wrote an article a couple of weeks ago predicting that the United States was going to cancel the 2026 and 2028 elections because the polls show that he was going to lose. He was going to use the military and political and organizational attributes of the national security state to eliminate the election and declare himself the winner. This is no ordinary person. Chris Hedges won the Pulitzer Prize for journalism. He's one of the most respected people in that field in the world. How could he possibly say? But he documented it. So all I have to say in this regard was, despite the horrors that the New York Times, one of the most dishonest corporate newspapers in the country, have to say about the Republicans, they expose them daily a bit. The truth is that the Democrats did and do the exact same thing. Obama organized 6 of his own wars to slaughter people. What's the name of the past US president? Joseph Biden said the war in Afghanistan was a mistake. And the same thing with the Iraq war. The United States engaged in those 2 wars, both parties supporting them, because they wanted to keep the oil of those 2 oil-rich countries off the world markets. So when the Iranians had a revolution in 1979, the United States organized a coup that overthrew the democratically elected president of that country, Mohammad Mossadegh. When the Iranians did the same thing, the United States a couple of decades later, the United States orchestrated the Iran-Iraq war, and they had their ally, who they later demonized, Saddam Hussein, organize a war against Iran that killed 800,000 Iranians and 1 million Iraqis. That's 2 million people. It's the same statistics everywhere. The United States slaughtered 400,000 Guatemalan indigenous people, Mayan people, because they had a president who dared to nationalize a bit of their United Fruit Corporations. They supported the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua and the Batista dictatorship in the United States. They did a little cover once in a while when the United States overthrew the Dominican Republic government. Their excuse was at the time that the Dominican Republic had 9 known communists in the government. So they sent the US Army to overthrow the government. And when there were massive protests, this is during the Vietnam era, the United States sent an eyewitness observer with incredible credibility to oversee the US elections in the Dominican Republic. Raise your hand if you know who they sent to the Dominican Republic to oversee the US military's orchestration of an election. His name is Norman Thomas. He was the head of the Socialist Party of the United States, the party that includes DSA today. Norman Thomas was legally blind, and they sent him to oversee a US imposed dictatorship because his name was a socialist.
5 minutes remaining.
I'm sorry, say it again.
5 minutes remaining.
Oh, thank you. I have 5 minutes left. Thank you. So what I'm describing is the norm of US capitalism. Joseph Biden was the president of the United States. He was elected when he ran against a field of 29 candidates, including Bernie Sanders. And when Bernie Sanders did well in the early polls, the US ruling class decided to pull the plug. The billionaires in the race, including Bloomberg in New York City and others, all pulled out, including Bernie Sanders, and the United behind the presidential candidate who eventually won, Joseph Biden. Joseph Biden historically was the Northern liberal Democrats, and I say liberal in quotation marks, that was assigned to do the mediation between the Southern racist bigot segregationists for decades in the South. And that is, the official Democratic Party was a combination of Northern liberal billionaires like the Kennedy family and Southern racist Klansmen, White Citizen Council Democrats. Biden was their representative. Biden spoke at the funeral of the leading racist bigots, Strom Thurmond and others. So he was a reliable agent of the ruling class. As Kshama pointed out, the twin parties of capitalism don't have a single representative that represents the American people. And once in a blue moon, when they pick someone like, what's his name, the mayor of New York, Mamdani, to be the showcase to show that the future of the Democrats is going to be progressive, they think that the working class has no historic memory. The fact that the last presidential candidate introduced a piece of legislation that was worse in regard to deportation of immigrants than the Biden administration and the woman who was his running mate, who then became the Democrats' candidate. They had a more reactionary program on everything. When the Democrats run Congress, the military budget goes up. The United States spends more on the military than the rest of the world combined. The Soviet Union and China spend peanuts relative to what the United States does. So the idea that Kshama and I are going to tour the United States in the name of explaining to a radicalizing section of working people what socialism really means, that is, the abolition of a capitalist system, not by some left-wing people who throw bombs or coups, but by organizing the American working class to defend themselves, their own interests, against increasing capitalist repression. And that's what we see today. United States offshored millions of jobs to China. Why? Because they could have, when they allowed China into the World Trade Organization in 2001, they could have Chinese teenage women working in dormitory factories for 80 hours a week for 6 cents an hour. Why the hell pay union wages when you can hire Chinese near slaves? And the Chinese had millions of them.
1 minute.
Friends who think that China remains a worker state are arguing that China is certainly not capitalist. They have no answer to the question, other than to say, well, the Chinese have significantly raised their wages. But the minimum wage in China is still a little over $2 an hour. That's the source of Chinese wealth, not some amazing technology. And the Chinese are the largest polluters of fossil fuel in the world. In the world. So Kshama and I have the proud responsibility to tell the truth about capitalism. To tell the truth that socialism is an egalitarian system that, for the first time since the Russian Revolution and the Cuban Revolution, which I support, for the first time is a society where the majority rule in their own name through their own control of the economy, in a society not based on capitalist profits, but in a society based on fulfilling human needs. In the socialism that we project, the jails will be virtually empty in no time, whereas today the richest country in the world has the largest number and percentage of its population in prison than any nation on earth. Why? Not just because the racist cops are evil, but because imprisonment in prison is profitable. Why pay an immigrant the minimum wage when you can hire a near slave working in a U.S. prison for an average of 25 cents an hour, or is it 50 cents an hour? So prison labor is increasingly the norm in American capitalism. And who hires these people? The largest corporations in America, not small-scale corporations, but big business. We are for the abolition of the, quote, capitalist system, which is a system run by less than 1% of the most powerful, richest, filthy bastards there are in the world. Today, the government has yet to release another thousands of pages of the, what's his name, Epstein-Trump files, which shows that the president himself was engaged with Epstein and was a virtual financial partner, exploiting, raping, pillaging, torturing young teenage women and younger for the thrill of the ruling rich. And I'm saying ruling rich, I mean the handful of billionaires who included the president of Harvard, kings and monarchs around the world, the Saudi monarchy, all in conjunction with American billionaires for the pleasure of the few. We have to end this rotten system, and I'm very, very proud to say that Kshama and I are in the same ballpark, considering deeper collaboration in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Inspiring speeches by both of you. Thanks so very, very much. Now we're going to open the floor up for Q&A. And I'm going to take 3 questions. If there are 3 hands up, I will take 3 and then go back to the panelists. And you have up to 2 minutes to make your intervention or ask your question. So, okay, John P.
I'll need to unmute there. There we go.
Okay, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I know we're in agreement on the Democratic Party, but I noticed in the past, for instance, at the March on the DNC in 2024, that you were campaigning for Jill Stein. And I've always considered the Green Party to be more or less a pressure group on the Democratic Party. And I'm wondering what your opinion of Jill Stein and the Green Party is.
Okay, thank you. Barry, 2 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, comrades and friends, we just heard 2 of the best speakers in North America who bring a dynamism, who are incisive and grounded in the class struggle. So I really want to thank both of them. I think, Kshama, your statement about the gatekeepers is very evocative. In order to win $15 an hour or more, because it continues to rise because of the escalator you built into it, it was necessary to overcome the gatekeepers inside our own movement, inside the working class. And we find the same is the case in Canada with the right-wing leadership of the NDP and the Canadian Labour Congress unions. You explain what the United Front is, that it puts workers' interests first. Capitalism is in crisis, and we need to put the interests of working people first. But what elements? Well, the answer to that can be found in a document that retains its relevance today, the Transitional Program, which Trotsky introduced as a proposal for the political basis of principles for the Fourth International. Davos, Switzerland was the scene of a speech by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, and he said the rules-based world order is finished. But we have to ask the question, what was it before it was finished? Was it paradise? I think it was an imperial cooperation between the giant rulers. And now, what is it now? It's increasingly imperial conflict over imperial spheres of influence. They invoke the Monroe Doctrine in the West, although it was written hundreds of years ago, It's gained a new utility for the rulers, and they use it to starve Cuba, to threaten to seize Panama, to buy or occupy Greenland, to impose tariffs on any country whose government disagrees with this approach, this savage approach. So what's our answer to this? How can we overcome this boss's agenda with a worker's agenda? Because I'm convinced, as you are, together we can win. Thanks.
Any more questions? One more question. Somebody would like to get in on the first round? Okay.
Ted from Ontario.
Yes, go ahead, Ted.
Yeah. I just wanted to speak or ask a question about coalition building. I'm right with what Kshama said. I'm here because of Kshama's interview with Chris Hedges last year. I'm wondering how we build coalitions and still stay radical. And can we look to unlikely partners, like I mentioned in our discussion last night about the Minneapolis general strike, where I think coalitions were built with small farmers who might be more conservative? Are there coalitions we can build with libertarians regarding foreign policy? I'm not talking about betraying our values as socialists, but what are some practical ways to move forward with winning votes while staying true to our principles? I know it's not an easy question to answer. Thank you for letting me pass. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to go back to the panel now. They can answer 1, 2, 3 questions, and I'm going to give them 5 minutes each to do so. And we're going to start with Jeff. You're muted, Jeff.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Okay.
I thought you were an expert in lip reading, so I am going to
Not quite.
read.
Mind reading, yes, but not lip reading.
Right. On John's question, Socialist Action has never supported the Greens. We do support working class parties and working class people building their own parties based on organizations that workers can affect, like the trade unions. Working people have little or no effect on the Green Party. It's run more or less as a top-down organization. It's not a socialist group, and it's not a... So anyway, Kshama and I are under discussion about relations with the Green Party. We think that the Green Party should be included in any and all United Front mass actions, which is another question. But whether or not we should support it, Socialist Action doesn't, but we'll continue that discussion. How to win. And by the way, I want to mention Cuba for a second. The Cubans today are under siege. They are the most beleaguered people in the world. And that's because they made a revolution that abolished capitalism. They had to make a choice close to the beginning when the United States basically said, organized an invasion to overthrow the Cuban government that was elected, that took power in 1959 in a popular revolution that overthrew the murderous Batista dictatorship. And when the United States responded with an invasion, Fidel Castro said, we're going to nationalize the capitalist class down to the nails of the boots of their shoes. And he did that. He gave the land to the peasants. He established a strong element of workers' control of the factories, and he armed the people to maintain that revolution. And when the United States did invade, he jumped in a tank along with thousands of Cubans and defeated the US Army. So the Cubans are still our example. And now they are beleaguered as never before in US history. In the past, they had the Russians to bail them out. Today, the Soviet Union doesn't exist, and the aid that the Chinese and the Russians give them is minimal in comparison to the embargo, blockade, and assassinations. I say assassinations when Obama allowed Fidel Castro to visit the United States because the Pope had visited Cuba and gave the Cubans some credibility. The United States, the Cubans asked the president, how many times have you tried to assassinate the president of Cuba, Fidel Castro? And the government of the United States and the Cubans said, we have 35 down on our list of assassinations. And the CIA director was given the question, and he said, well, we only have proof that we tried to kill Fidel 27 times. Today, the number that the United States admits to of assassination attempts against the Cuban president is over 100. That's not the exception. That's the norm that they do in 135 countries, anyone who disagrees for 2 seconds. So our solution on the United Front question is not to assassinate people in return. Our solution is mass action. And I want you to listen to this carefully. Mass action is not some kind of fancy words that revolutionaries use. We pioneered it in the United States during the Vietnam era, when the government said, well, we are the majority. Yes, we're the silent majority, said every US president that was using genocide against the Vietnamese people. So we started organizing demonstrations, and the first one in Washington had 10,000 people. We were all shocked, said, my God, there are 10,000 of us in Washington. And the comrades who hadn't seen a demonstration like that were shocked. And then we had 20,000, and then 50,000. And all of these were democratically organized through mass conferences. The largest was in 1971 at NYU. I was there, New York University. We had 5,000 people democratically debating and planning the conference. And we turned out over 1 million people, which was the largest demonstration in the history of the United States. What was the effect of this demonstration and all others of this type? They exposed the lie that the government represents the majority, the myth that the US capitalist class perpetrates every day of our existence, that the elected people represent the people of the United States. Today, for the first time on every issue, whether it be immigration rights or war or Palestine or ICE abolition, the polls show that a majority of the people, or a plurality of the people, oppose US policies on the critical issues of the day, including socialism. A plurality supports socialism over capitalism. The massive mobilizations of people in this context, in the streets, independent of the capitalists, through our own organizations, backed by hundreds and thousands of coalitions and unions, coupled with strikes, general strikes, convinces the majority that they are the majority and that they should rule. What else is there? If we show that we represent the millions and the ruling class has no resort other than to resort to repression and murder and shooting, like the woman in Minneapolis, Gold, and the others, that has more to do with the education than 1 million flyers. The mass mobilization convinces people, opens them up to our ideas, to the speakers and the millions of flyers that we pass out, that we represent the majority. And if we build simultaneously a mass revolutionary socialist organization deeply rooted in every struggle of the American people, we demonstrate that we have the ability to rule. And that's what we want to do. Demonstrate that we are justified in ruling in our own name through our own organizations.
Thanks, Jeff. Kshama?
Thanks. On the Green Party question and Jill Stein question, what I would stress is that our position in relation to the Jill Stein campaigns is that we should support the strongest left independent candidate, and I do understand that there's a difference there. But just to explain from our end, yeah, we did not ever hide our differences with the Green Party. We were open about them, but not in a counterproductive way. I mean, we used our own material to campaign for Jill Stein. We weren't using their material because we do have disagreements with some of their positions, and we want to point towards the crucial need for class independence. And we've also been extremely clear that we don't think that the Green Party is what's needed, and they don't the Green Party leaders don't agree with that, but we're very open about that. I mean, just to give you an example, we had the inaugural National Convention of Workers' Strike back in February last year, and it was a really, really fantastic, lively debate. It was truly democracy in action in the way that we see as Marxists, where working class people could actually debate on the workers' strike back political program, who the elected leadership should be, and also the overall what we call the Fight the Rich agenda, Fight the Rich program there. And one of those debates was that there were Green Party members who were also members of Workers' Strike Back. They thought that as part of our program, we should not have one of the clauses shouldn't be that we need a new working class party in the United States, because they see themselves as the new party. We debated them openly in a friendly way, but we were very clear we don't agree with that. And then the overwhelming majority voted for the formulation that we had, which is a mass working class party that's needed, a new mass working class party that's needed. So, that's the approach we use. On the question on building coalitions, which is a very important question, because this is one of the major pitfalls in movements and in movement leadership, a fundamental misunderstanding, and I refer to this in my introductory remarks, but there's a misunderstanding that people have, that even well-meaning people have, that if you want to build coalitions to win anything, then you have to make allowances for the leaders, many of whom will play the role of gatekeepers. That is not how we as Marxists, as Trotskyists, understand coalition building. That is why I was trying to clarify what the United Front means in reality, which is that we want to build the broadest possible unity among working class people, but bring that working class power to bear in order to win victories, and really in order to force the hand of many of these gatekeeping leaders who will initially not join the movement, but then they will be forced to join. That is exactly how we built the $15 movement, which I explained, but it's also what we did with the Tax Amazon movement. We did have some of the leaders of the Black community, self-appointed leaders, some of the other leaders of housing and renters' rights and so on. They were part of what we call the Tax Amazon Coordinating Committee that was elected by a democratically organized Tax Amazon Action Conference, where the rank and file working people had the right to discuss and debate and vote on all of that. But at the moment that committee was formed and the George Floyd rebellion began, we immediately started seeing a lot of the people who were initially sort of supportive leaders, who were sort of supportive of the Tax Amazon movement, immediately started playing a gatekeeping role. For example, the Black leaders, whom I call Black misleaders, they started they started becoming sort of the spokespeople for the Democratic Party and for big business, and started spreading this completely toxic and very sort of anti-class solidarity position, which said that the Tax Amazon is not a Black issue. We disagreed with them. And so the common understanding of coalition, especially in relation to, these are the leaders who supposedly represent the movement at that time, which is the George Floyd rebellion. The common understanding, the completely mistaken understanding of coalition building would be that we should bend to those leaders. We refused to do that. We focused on building the working class movement for the Amazon tax. We said that actually the Amazon tax, is to tax big business, billionaires like Jeff Bezos, in order to fund a massive expansion annually of hundreds of millions of dollars for affordable housing. And the community that will be the most beneficial in benefiting from that disproportionately is Black working class and poor people. So we don't agree with you at all. We're going to go to the rank and file of the George Floyd rebellion, of the Black Lives Matter movement, and ask them what they think. And it was incredible. The response we received was just incredible. I mean, we went there with our clipboard saying, do you want to tax Amazon to build affordable housing. And people would grab the clipboards from us and say, yes, absolutely, I want to do that. And it was multiracial working class unity in the movement for the Amazon tax. And that is the basis on which we collected 30,000 signatures for the ballot initiative of the tax Amazon, which ended up just like the 15, in the case of the $15 wage, the tax Amazon ballot initiative getting 30,000 signatures made it a viable campaign, meaning that if the city council didn't pass our Amazon tax on the city council through a city council vote, we would go directly to the voters. And it was clear that we would, that we had a very strong chance of winning with the voters because we had such huge numbers of support for the Amazon tax ballot initiative petition. And that is how we were able to win the Amazon tax, by actually defeating many of the gatekeepers. So I think it's extremely important to remember that that is not the idea, that is not the basis. Like, bending to the gatekeepers is not the idea on which we can build coalitions that can actually win. But yes, in terms of the other part of the question that was raised, absolutely, we want to build the maximum possible principled solidarity with all sections of the working class. And as the speaker said, as the question, the person who asked the question said, absolutely, we will do that without bending to ideas that we don't agree with, but at the same time, trying to bring along as wide as possible of a working class. And in fact, that is how we intend to use our congressional office if we win, which we have a real shot at winning, but that's why we need support from tens of thousands of people. But if we win, we are going to, our intention is to build a national platform, and we are already doing that with Worker Strike Back. Obviously, if we win the congressional office, it will be much, much bigger. We will have a platform that will give us an audience of millions of people. And yes, absolutely, we want to emphasize the maximum possible principled unity on a working class basis.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have our next three questions. We have two people online, which I will go. The first question on the chat is from Max Irwin. What is your position on Ukraine-Russia war? Why do you think Russia is or is not imperialist, and why do you not support military victory against imperialism, against NATO and Ukrainian fascists? And now that's question number one. Now we will go to Kelvin online. I think it's Kelvin. Yes, Kelvin Priest online, and then to Gary. Kelvin?
Yeah, I actually didn't have a question. I had a short comment. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak a little bit more about what Kshama and Jeff were just speaking about the question of coalitions. And I think it is an absolutely crucial question because a misunderstanding of the idea of how, of how to approach coalitions is, completely undermines movements. The idea that we have to come to some sort of compromise with the leaders of different unions or leaders of different organizations, of different progressive Democrats, is completely hamstrings the movements at present, and it's not the approach that that the Bolsheviks that Marxists have taken. The United Front, as it was understood and practiced by the Bolshevik Party, did not base itself on trying to appease different sections of the leadership of different organizations. It based itself clearly and directly on the interests of the working class, and that was the North Star, was fighting for the interests of the working class and fighting, for a revolutionary program. And that often means standing up against the leaders of different organizations, including ones who would be seen as progressive by the working class. And the way we do that, of course, is we have to take into account the consciousness of the working class in terms of how we address those leaders. And of course, first and foremost, the working class demands unity from us. So we have to go into an effort to build unity with other forces, but not by making concessions, by building the strongest possible movement, fighting for a clear class struggle-based strategy and overcoming the opposition of those leaders and ultimately exposing those leaders. And so that's how, that approach is fundamentally different from the basic idea of coalitions, which is endless compromises with, those who at the end of the day support capitalism, even if they claim to be socialist or anti-capitalist. And I was going to speak about the tax Amazon example that Kshama gave, and I know I only have like 2 minutes here. So I'll just say briefly that in addition to what Kshama was saying about the BLM leaders, there was also just the reality of the progressive Democrats who opposed even the slogan "Tax Amazon" because they didn't want to antagonize Amazon and big business. And there were socialists who thought that our approach to this should be to drop that slogan, to drop the idea of pinpointing Amazon.
30 seconds.
Okay, who of course Amazon, of course, there's huge anger at Amazon, and there was particularly in Seattle at that time because Seattle, Amazon is the most dominant business and is responsible for huge increases in in the cost of living in Seattle, and so we were tapping into that anger, very effectively, as Kshama said. But had we listened to and made compromises with the progressive Democrats, with the labor leaders, we would have dropped that entirely. But not only dropped that slogan, we would have dropped the class struggle approach, and that class struggle approach, which we ultimately used against these other, these misleaders, against the labor leaders, against the progressive Democrats, was absolutely crucial. We had a series of Democratic, we call them action conferences.
Your time's up.
Of hundreds of people, and that was the basis on which we built ultimately a mass movement that forced the Democrats to vote for the Amazon tax.
Thank you. Gary? Gary, you're muted.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay. The anti-war movement, as I recollect in Canada, was much the same experience as the United States. That is, we tried to make it the broadest possible movement and even invited churches who were willing to support the fight against the war in Vietnam. We invited everybody. Obviously, we started with labor. We started, at the time, there was a powerful movement on the campuses, and that was the engine of the movement. And so we ran into opposition from the Communist Party, which wanted slogans like negotiate, and there was nothing to negotiate. The United States had no right in Vietnam. They had nothing to negotiate. And we said, out now, out now. Bring the troops home, out now. So the thing was that we, as has been said here, we weren't willing to compromise on program. We fought for our program, and we mobilized and lobbied and did everything we could to have a principled program that gave nothing to the imperialist intervention in Vietnam, or that the imperialists had any right to do so. So we fought for a clear program. And that's how we, and mass decision-making meetings. That was something else. The Communist Party and the Social Democrats, they liked smaller meetings where leaders all got together and discussed this and they could work compromises. We wanted mass meetings of all the activists or delegations from groups of activists who could discuss these issues and vote directly. And generally speaking, what that meant is that we won overwhelmingly by a democratic vote. The other thing was that mass action, as opposed to individual action, is a tremendous experience for participants. They go through this thing of seeing all these other people and all these speakers representing different wings of the movement, and they just feel transformed by the mass action. They moved quickly. At the time, they were moving, among other things, right into League for Socialist Action, which was what we were at the time. In Canada, we have a Labour Party. A Labour Party is called the New Democratic Party. It was formed in 1961 by a fusion between the Social Democratic Cooperative Commonwealth Federation and the newly formed Canadian Labour Congress, which is a merger of craft unions and industrial unions. And the union leadership participated directly in the founding of this Labour Party. It was based on affiliated trade unions and local riding associations, and it still exists. During its history of since 1961, it has brought some reforms to Canada, such as Medicare is probably the biggest single one, why we have Medicare and the United States doesn't. As far as we can see from Canada, you don't have Medicare. You have private insurance, and that's not the same. This is state-paid, single-payer, comprehensive Medicare. So that's one of the things they want, and they've won other things like that. But they're misleaders. I mean, they're social democrats. They're committed to the capitalist system. They're for reform, and and we all know that you can't reform capitalism. So so that they have made the NDP an ossified, bureaucratic, and shrinking organization. The last election, they only elected 8 members of parliament. There was a time when they were the official opposition. Now they're not even an official party recognized in parliament. So they're really they cannot bring themselves to move to the left to respond to the needs of labor, and they're
Please wrap up.
yeah, okay. So we're in a different process. We've been fighting. They have a leadership contest, and we have put forward first one and then a second candidate, which they've disqualified for nonsense reasons. Purely, it's just social democrats are fighting socialists, and they refuse to let us participate. We have some serious thinking to do about our orientation to the New Democratic Party, and we're in the process of evolving out of the
Wrap up, comrade.
out of the supporters of this new group, new campaign, what we're going to do about that. But I look for news.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Okay, the last question for this round is from Curie. I would like to know the difference between Trotsky and Michael Parenti. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, Parenti, towards the class struggle. Okay, so these are the 3 questions. You have 5 minutes each to answer, and we're going to start with Kshama and then Jeff.
Okay, I'll try to answer some of the questions. I might miss some of them. On the question about, what is your position on the Ukraine-Russia war? Why do you think Russia is or is not imperialist? And why do you not support military victory against imperialism? All that. I mean, I'll say that first and foremost, and most fundamentally, we base ourselves as Marxists and Trotskyists, we base ourselves on working class internationalism. And the paramount fact about the Russia-Ukraine war is that it's an inter-imperialist proxy war. In fact, at this moment and for now the last 2 years, I think it has not even been controversial in mainstream media and corporate media, because even many of the people in the diplomatic circles, the bourgeois circles, they openly admit that that is what it is. But they are obviously they have a very, very pro-imperialist position. But the point is that we also think it's an inter-imperialist proxy war, and we don't support either US imperialism or China, Russia imperialism in that war or in any war. And in fact, we know that we also our analysis also tells us that this is going to be far from the last war that is, hot war that is going to be played out in this inter-imperialist rivalry in this period of deep crisis of capitalism. And so the only position that we can have, and a consistent position we can have, is working class internationalism. So in other words, supporting both Ukrainian and Russian working class people. In fact, if you look at the polls, the working class of both countries is absolutely devastated by the war and wants it to end. The polls in Ukraine, for example, are most poignant. They were very strongly in support of the war at the beginning, and now they have completely flipped 180 degrees, and they want the war to end. So we support both the Ukrainian workers and the Russian workers in their opposition to war. We oppose any kind of sanctions also against Russia, because those sanctions, the weight of those sanctions lands on working class people, and has been, for example, we've seen much more data coming from Venezuela sanctions, but we know how sanctions work. They land on the backs of working class and poor people, and it's very crucial that Marxists oppose all those sanctions. And we do think Putin is imperialist. Russia is an imperialist power, and yes, there was provocation from the threat of NATO aggression, but Putin is also responding to the threat of class struggle within Russia, and also from the uprisings in various other nations in that region, including Kazakhstan and Belarus and other struggles. And so we cannot see this through the lens of nationality, because that would be absolutely fatal for us. We have to see this from a class angle, and seeing it from that angle, you can recognize that actually we cannot stand in support of any imperialist power, whether it is Russia or China or it is the United States. Obviously, the United States, those of us who are working class people in the United States, we have a very big responsibility on our shoulders to build revolutionary movements against US imperialism, but we have to do that while understanding that it has to be part of an international working class movement. And also, all of this also has to include a very clear analysis of the role that someone like Zelensky is playing. We don't have any illusions in Zelensky either. Yeah, I'll wrap up on this. We don't have any illusions on Zelensky. Zelensky also represents the interests of capitalism and imperialism. In fact, if you look at the kind of repression his regime has carried out against workers and the trade union movement, all of that shows that, and also this is continuing, carrying out of the war. All of that shows that he is being on his side is not in the interests of Ukrainians, and being on Putin's side is not in the interests of the Russians. I mean, working class people. And so the only way we can solve this problem is through international revolutionary movements.
Thank you. Jeff?
Thanks, Elizabeth. To answer these questions in 5 minutes can never do justice to the seriousness and importance of the questions. So I want to say this. On the previous question of how to build a coalition, there is no formula. In Vietnam, we had a simple formula, as Gary said, 2 words, out now. And it was the most hotly debated issue at every anti-war conference, because the Stalinists, who had control of 1/3 of the unions in the CIO, wanted to say, negotiate now. And our view was the United States has no right to negotiate the future of any poor and oppressed nations anywhere. Just get the hell out. That's our position on Venezuela. We have criticisms of the Venezuelan, Nicaraguan, and other governments, but wherefore US hands off, out now. So the issue is presented to us by capitalism, not out of our heads. We don't sit around in socialist action meetings saying, well, what slogan should we raise in the abstract? But in the past, we've learned some lessons. We wanted to have principled issues, not too many, that captured the imagination and interest that affected working class people directly and were organized independent of the capitalist parties. Today, the capitalists have learned some lessons. They don't want to see independent organizations. That's why they have the, what do you call their thing? No King's Day, which is basically saying get rid of the King, Trump, and let's elect the Democrats. And they bring on board the central leaders in every city of the Democratic Party to corral people back into the Democratic Party. So here we have a contradiction. And we try to resolve it by going to the demonstrations with our own signs and banners, but continuing our mass independent work in every institution where there are working people and young people, to try to convince them of the validity of our line and what's wrong with the Democratic Party organized demonstrations. But once again, the issues are the ones. When they murdered George Floyd in open daylight, millions of people came into the streets and said Black Lives Matter, but that movement was co-opted almost instantly by the Democratic Party and the Ford Foundation, who gave each of the central leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement $1 million to start their coalitions. And the day that the election started, they took that movement back into the Democratic Party because there was a crisis of leadership and the Democratic Party proved incapable of it. If we have a party that's deeply involved in the struggles for freedom and liberation, as we were in the Vietnam era, the Democrats are not going to be able to co-opt it. But that takes time and patience in building the Revolutionary Party, and there's no substitute for it. The coalitions depend on the times. The Bolsheviks had 3 slogans: bread, land, and peace. That's because the Russian people were starving. The peasants were already taking the land in the countryside, while the peasants were also sent to the front. And the Bolsheviks at the front, who were integrated into the Tsarist army, said, why the hell are we fighting German workers when we should go home and take the land like the Russian peasants? And they did it. And peace was, why are we supporting this war that is taking the lives of millions of people? It's a war for the rich, for Russian colonies. We don't need to colonize other people. So in every mass movement, the slogans are not derived out of our heads in the abstract, but rather are derived from the needs of the people and how we can popularize them and mobilize
Please wrap up.
and independently is a critical question. On Ukraine, Socialist Action has an interesting position. When the war in Ukraine started, it was started 10 years ago when the United States, in our view, orchestrated a military coup that overthrew the government of Ukraine and sent thousands of Ukrainian troops, fascist troops, to eastern Ukraine in order to slaughter the Russian-speaking people. We were against that. We were for the right of the Russian-speaking people to live. 700,000 Russian-speaking people left the Ukraine to Russia. And they had the support of the vast majority of the Russian people. The polls showed that the overwhelming majority of the Russian people supported the war, supported the Russian position, not because they agreed with the policies of the Russian government, but rather because they were against the slaughter of their friends who lived on the other side of the border, who spoke Russian their whole lives. So we said no to the US-backed war. We were also operating in the context of the truth. The truth is the United States had troops virtually everywhere in the world, 110 countries, whereas the Russians had troops in 6. To say that they're both imperialist and therefore we condemn both equally is a big distortion of the reality. The reality was that the US imperialism organized a mass army of the same people that they sent to Syria from ISIS to slaughter the Syrian people. And that's why we supported Syria's right to self-determination, even though the US backed the reactionary forces that overthrew eventually the Syrian government. So each situation requires its own individual solution. Yes, we are, and by the way, the agreements that the Russians and the Ukrainians signed on Ukraine supported the right of self-determination of the Eastern Ukrainians. They don't do that now. They don't do that now, but they will. So let me see. The final question and the most important is, what do we do now? What's our program? Our program is opposition to all US imperialist wars. And our method is to mobilize millions to convince them that they are the majority, that they have the right to make the decision. In the Vietnam War, when we raised this question, people argued, oh, the United States has the right to go and make war. We said, no, let the people vote on war. And that was a key demand. Let's vote on the war. The imperialists never wanted to do that, because once you get into the mode of the American people voting on policy, that raises the question of who should rule. Mass mobilization is a statement that we are the majority, as the majority oppose the US horrors committed against this, the murders of
30 seconds, Jeff.
Okay, of the 2 people in Minneapolis. There's deep anger in that, and that's why 50,000 people, perhaps 100,000, came out. So good questions. I wish we had more time to do it, but we're running up against the time limit. I urge you to contact Revolutionary Workers, Kshama's group, get involved. Socialistaction.org is our website, and Elizabeth will give you the Socialist Action Canada website. I think it's socialistaction.ca. So get in touch with us, join us, become part of this mass movement. We are not a group of isolated maniacs running around the street with socialist demands. I just answer quickly on Michael Parenti and Trotsky. There's no comparison, but Michael Parenti in his last year was a good friend of mine. We used to go out to dinner regularly. He developed Alzheimer's and just died last week ago. And he came from sort of a left social democratic movement, but he was moving towards our position under the influence of the mass movement. I asked him to join, and he almost considered it. He was a very fine, honest, revolutionary fighter whose ideas changed in the last years of his life under the pressure of the mass movement, and because there were groups like Socialist Action that had the answers to the key questions that he had been discussing and debating all his life.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. I expect my bottle of wine in the mail for that extra time. Okay. So, but on a serious note, if you agree with what you heard during this program, please join Socialist Action Canada or indeed Socialist Action USA. Just sign up at our website, www.socialistaction.ca, or by calling 647-986-1917. Easy to remember. 1917 was the year of the Russian Revolution. So a special thanks to tonight's speakers, Kshama and Jeff. We thank you very much. It was inspiring, educational, and I hope that we can do this again and have more time for more questions. I would also, and I know Kshama is going to be joining us again for International Women's Day, so it'll be a pleasure to hear you again, comrade. So please consider, as I said, being a supporter of Socialist Action publications. We will send them to you online. Thank you to our audience for participating and to our technical producer, Kiri, and our political producer, Barry. And once again, also, if you like this show tonight, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube, because this is being recorded and you can watch it all over again, or if you've missed some of it, on YouTube. The next SA Canada webcast will be on Sunday, March the 8th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be a celebration of International Women's Day, and the featured speakers will be Bianca Mugini, Jasmine Pearden, Imogen Savior, Robina Chowdhury, and Kshama Sawant, and myself. So please check the SA Canada website for details. In the meantime, the struggle continues. So please be happy, healthy, and active. Good night, everybody.